Hi, Zoe Talk here. This is the long-awaited, actually, I don't know if anyone was waiting for it anymore, video 4 for chapter 3 of Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, The Orient, and Other Others. I think I left off around page 142, 142, 143. Um, this is about the time where, from Ahmed's discussion on the discourse of stranger danger and the idea that the stranger becomes a stranger because of some trace of a dubious origin. Um, that is her transition into a conversation about mixed orientations. Um, Okay, so let's talk about the section mixed orientations. On page 143, Ahmed writes, a phenomenology that can account for racial differences then would return us to the temporality of the background. And this is in scare quotes so that we know this is both a spatial and a familial background. To how one's racial dwelling is shaped by the conditions of one's arrival. And here she considers what a mixed genealogy might mean. When considering mixed genealogies, we need to reflect on the different histories of racialization that already read the mixed body by bringing that body in line. And Ahmed cites Naomi Zak to the effect that the mixed race body does not historically exist. Of course, that doesn't mean that mixed race persons don't historically exist, but that there's a historical precedent of assigning mixedness to blackness before Ahmed, I should say, turns to the two primary ways in which the mixed race body enters public culture as spectacle. And one of these, you could say, is the either or, and one of them is the neither nor. So the either or is when the mixed race person is idealized as the new hybridity, and in the other scenario, um, they are considered in the logic of the double negative, right? So neither, rather than you're both of these races, cultures, identities, you're neither of these races, cultures, identities. Um, 145, here Ahmed talks about the idea of family resemblance again in light of the mixed race body. And again, here I'm using Ahmed's terminology. Ahmed talks about the feeling that she has, or had rather, as a child walking with her parents, her feeling of being more on one side than the other, the disidentification that causes her to wonder what does it mean to want to be white by being orientated in this way? And she identifies this as a problem of the relationship between identification and alliance formation. So 146, in order to show how siding matters, like the way that we take sides or are said to take after a certain side, Ahmed continues to consider the implications of the spatialization of her desire to distance herself from her father, that's her Pakistani side, um, both literally and figuratively as a disavowal of a part of herself. And she writes that in this desire, it is the proximity of distance that is seen as a bad inheritance. Um, and this follows her general observation that for things to be strange or foreign, they need to be near, and that something can't become one until it becomes the other. So she considers mixed race through this framework, and also through the framework that she traced in the previous chapter, or previous sections rather, of the towardness and aroundness, in the sense that what we're facing indicates what is around us, although it may not necessarily be at the center of our gaze. um, Ahmed writes that when orientations fail, something happens. Things move. The double negative does not necessarily lead to depression. I'm inclined to speculate that for Ahmed, the reason why is that it opens up this space for thought and for consideration, and for contemplation, um, about uh, not only her own identity, but the implications that that has, for her theoretical approaches. So something opens up. 147. Here Ahmed turns back to objects, and talks about how objects as well as people have their own trajectories of arrival, asking what objects gather in our homes. We should take care to remember how such objects arrive. And again, she makes herself her own sort of experimental subject, um, thinking about her childhood, thinking about the Christmas cards and English. I wrote in my notes English crap, the wedding gifts that arrive from England, and Australia. Um, and then sums it up in this way: objects also have their own horizons, the worlds from which they emerge and which surround them. The horizon is about how objects surface, how they emerge, which shapes their surface and the direction they face, or what direction we face when we face them. So if we follow such objects, we enter different worlds. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this quote, um, because it has to do with perception in a kind of literal and metaphorical way. So there's the figure ground distinction. When we look at an object, we're doing something projective. We're doing something a little bit creative in the sense that we draw a line around it and distinguish it from its setting, right? And it becomes distinct to us as an object when we turn to it. Um, but I think also, Ahmed is talking about a broader horizon, and a kind of emergence that encompasses not only objects in their sensuous certainty, as Marx and Engels would say, but objects in the history of their arrivals, and following that to enter different worlds. So, and this is all embedded in the midst of a consideration of mixed genealogy, and specifically Ahmed's own family. So 148, she attends to what her father brings back from Pakistan. Quote, the strangeness or familiarity is not the property of such objects, but a matter of how we come into contact with them. And Ahmed brings in Mary Louise Pratt to talk about the idea of the home as a contact zone, but reminds us that contact is asymmetrical and it is a function of the proximities we inherit. It is important here that we don't consider cultures as objects that are already given. Rather, cultures come to be lived as having a certain shape, or even a skin, as an effect of such contact. And this will come back later in the conclusion, when Ahmed talks more about touch and the sense of touch within, phenomenology, and the sense of touch, for her, and what that means. So the contact zone, and, also, if we think of cultures as having a skin, then contact, is, sort of personified, or not personified, but it's like channeled through the sense of touch. 149, returning to Diana Fuss and the domestication of the Orient, exemplified by the Oriental carpets and Egyptian urns in Freud's office. These are the things that in the additional readings that I sent, H.D. the poet, who was analyzed by Freud, these are the things that caused her to refer to Freud's office as a cave of wonders, Aladdin's cave of wonders. And then also, I'm just going to point back here to the other reading, the chapter I sent from Marina Warner's, book on the 1001 Nights and its, reception and circulation, specifically her chapter on, the history of Freud's rugs. So Um, so this is all to say that contact might involve histories of appropriation, even if that appropriation speaks the language of love, curiosity, and care. And I think this is so important to acknowledge, even if that appropriation speaks the language of love, curiosity, and care. Appropriations are violent, and they can also create the background in which things do happen. Other things do happen. Um, and Ahmed turns at the close of 149 to diasporic spaces, noting that they too are shaped by object histories, um, whose objects come to embody lost homes, right? But they don't only return uh, the people who possess them to their lost homes. Ahmed cites Divya Tolia Kelly um, as a way into the idea that the proximity of objects is not a sign of nostalgia per se, but that such objects make new identities possible in the textures of the everyday. And as with mixed race identity, Ahmed is cautious not to idealize the contact zone, as well as to track how contact itself can reshape the ground on which it occurs. Um, and I would just like to pause and note at this moment that one of my favorite books, and a book that I'm thinking of reading soon in another group setting like this, is Svetlana Boym's The Future of Nostalgia. Um, and I think that Ahmed is wary of nostalgia as a concept, even despite the fact that she's very concerned with sort of the background or backwards or the beneath. Um, and, her constant riffing on lines and sides, but I'm thinking about Boehm's idea of sort of, she typologizes nostalgia, and that there, allows that there can be a critical nostalgia as well as the kind of nostalgia of like you know like the Trumpian fascist stage, which is nostalgic for a time that uh, never existed and will do violence in order to bring it about. So Ahmed says that the otherworldliness of objects does matter, and it gives objects more than one face. And that the question is not only how objects face us, but how we face them in the moment we see them facing different worlds. Um, they can draw us beyond themselves to another place. And on 151, Ahmed evokes the objects that arrived through her father from Pakistan and contrasts the feel of them to the objects that arrived from England, which was more proximate. She characterizes her home as a white space, down to language, noting that the only time I heard those words in Urdu or Punjabi at home was when my father was on the phone to Pakistan. Um, and yet, maybe those other words, even if I could not return their address, were enough for me to hear another side. Um, I don't have anything to say about that. I do think that it's quite beautiful, though. And even if maybe, and I don't know whether I'm projecting this, there's maybe a little bittersweetness. Tracing the history of her family leaving India during the partition, Ahmed talks about encountering this old set of Shakespeare's plays, and how these would actually lead back to Lahore for her. Quote, if a mixed genealogy takes us back to a time before our arrival, then it reminds us how orientations involve secrets, what we cannot uncover or recover about the histories that allow objects to gather in the way that they do. And the spectral history of objects in the mixed home. Ahmed describes the attempt to perceive the missing sides as a kind of conjuring, which, as she notes, puts a spin on Husserl's phenomenology, in that the missing side that he talks about, the part of the table he can't see, is also a missing history. Um, and I'm also given to wonder at this point, how these gaps in our knowledge, um, these like lacunae, might have a kinship with the secret that Cecilia described in our last conversation. Although I'm realizing now that I'm saying this, that if I reuse these videos and teach this book again, uh, people will watch this and wonder, what? Uh, but maybe this can just be part of the secret of our class. Um, so 153, Ahmed talks about what a mixed orientation offers. Quote, inheritance does not always hold things in place, but instead keeps open the space for new arrivals, for new objects which have their own horizons. If inheritance means to receive and to possess, it might also open up a gap between reception and possession. And I think that there can be some very useful contemplation on those two terms, their own proximity and distance. Um, to receive something doesn't necessarily mean to possess it. Um, I'm thinking of the idea, I mean, literally, Ahmed mentions inheritance, in a will. Specific items or assets are assigned to specific persons, um, to possess, to be remitted into their possession. Whereas, one might overhear a conversation or open up a piece of correspondence intended for someone else, and in that way we receive it. Um, Even though it's not necessarily designated as our possession. And I think it's interesting to think about that gap. Ahmed writes, the unreachability of some things can be affective. It can even put other worlds within reach. Um, and then she talks about the aunt who offers her a lifeline. In the sense that she writes, when we are redirected, we often have people behind us, those who offer us lifelines without any expectation of return, helping to pull us into another world. I think this is fascinating because previously, she has conjured the idea of normative genealogy, of the sort of like heteropatriarchal family structure that is this gift that must be received and then given again through the act of reproducing the family, literally and figuratively. But I think that there's something here too, where there can be, if there is queer kinship, there can also be um, queer ancestry, so to speak. And I think this is here in the aunt who offers a lifeline, um, and helps to pull Ahmed herself into another world. Um, so, 154, we could describe such a reorientation as a mixed orientation, an orientation that unfolds from the gap between reception and possession. And on 154, Ahmed talks about what discomfort can open up, then turns to David Eng for help talking about the potential queerness of genealogy as well as the potential queerness of diaspora. 155, quote, oddly enough, it is the backward glance that confirms the impossibility of this return as we face what is behind us. You go back to move on. So, returning to Fanon's Phenomenology of Race, by accounting for the I cannot, for the body that is stopped or held up, we also attend to the condition of possibility for the emergence of a collective form of activism. Um, and I think that this is one of these moments where Ahmed is hinting at, or sometimes more than hinting at, where one might move or expand on her phenomenology, her queer phenomenology, um, and put it to use within collective action. And so it's no accident here that she brings in Audre Lorde on the uses of anger and how regathering offers potential for new spaces of activism. Um, 156. This is, I think, the end of the section. Blackness itself is considered as a reorientation device. Quote, despite the ways in which it can it can risk concealing the differences between bodies that are of different colors and different histories behind us. Um, and Ahmed writes, finally, hopefully, maybe we don't know as yet what shape such a world might take or what mixtures might be possible when we no longer reproduce the lines we follow. And that is it for this chapter, although, of course, so much more could be said. Um, and the next video will cover the final section of the book, which is the conclusion, disorientation, and queer objects.